Well, it is quite an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. I won't go through the entire list of thank yous because you've heard it many times from the wonderful welcome messages, but I do want to just say again, thank you so much for all of the people who were involved in organizing this conference, in bringing me here, for the sponsors, to the Paris Academic Center, really to everyone involved, and particularly to Professor Malcolm Margalit, who was thanked many times. It's been wonderful to be here. I've actually been here for 2 weeks already, and did a lot of tourism. Actually, my mother and my father were here with me, and that was really a lot of fun. It's not my first time in Israel. I was here 20 years ago. It's actually an interesting span of 20 years, because 20 years ago when I was here last time, I was really just beginning my career doing research into hope, beginning my clinical psychology career. And now 20 years later, I'm here to tell you about the research that I've done, tell you all of what we've discovered during the last 20 years, and in fact, during the last 30 years of research into the power of hope in really multiple disciplines. I'm going to talk about education, I'm going to talk about mental health care, so psychotherapy, and I'm going to talk about physical health care and medicine in general, and how hope really influences all of those areas. I think another job that I have as the sort of first speaker, keynote speaker of this event is to lay a foundation and give you the context for the rest of the speakers. And so I think part of my job is to answer the question, what is hope? How do psychologists think about hope? How do scientists think about hope? Because I think it's similar to, in some ways, and different from the way that all of us think about hope in ordinary life. And I actually want to take a little inspiration in answering this question from some of my travels as a tourist during the last 2 weeks. I've had a chance to travel all over Israel. I'm sure you recognize these sites, and I've really been very much, I think, as many people who visit Israel are, impressed by the deep history of the land of Israel. Some of it ancient history, some of it more modern history, but really the depth of history, the thousands and thousands of years of history in this land. And so I thought I would take a little inspiration from that and actually begin at the very beginning of the history of hope, with the very first mention of what hope is in all of human literature that we have. This is an ancient Greek plate. And you may notice what it's depicting. I don't know if you know the story, the myth of Pandora. Do you all know that myth? So the myth of Pandora is actually quite similar to the creation of Eve in Genesis, and it's really the first mention of hope. So here we have the gods creating Pandora, who is the very first woman, and the story goes that the gods created her to be almost the perfect human being. They gave her many gifts. They gave her the gift of intelligence and wit and charm and beauty, and they sent her to Earth. And just before they sent her to Earth, they gave her one more gift. Right? You know what it is. It's Pandora's box. Now, I have a colleague and a friend who does research into ancient Greek mythology, and he has told me that actually if you go back to the original writings, it's not a box, it's a jar. But I'm used to calling it a box, so I will call it a box. And I just imagine that this box is just this beautiful gold box, see if you can imagine it, with jewels and beautiful design. It must have been gorgeous. And they sent her to Earth with this box, and of course they told her, no matter what you do, never open the box. I don't know about you, but the first thing I would do is open the box. So that's what she did. Being a normal human being, she let curiosity get the better of her, and she opened the box, and out of the box flew into the world all of the bad things that afflict humankind, right? It's out of the box flew evil and disease and poverty and war and meanness, treachery and trauma and all of the horrible things that we deal with as human beings today in our world. So the myth of Pandora is the ancient Greeks' explanation for why evil can exist in the world. Now, this is the end of the story for most people. Most people know the story up until this point, at least in the US. This is where people stop. But there's a little more to the story, and it has a lot to do with hope. So after Pandora let all of these evils into the world, she shut the box. She was obviously horrified. I can only imagine how she felt holding the box to her. But as she held the box, she realized there was still something inside of it. It still had weight. She kind of rattled it around. There was still something in there. So once again, letting curiosity get the better of her, she opened the box slightly, and deep down inside the box, barely visible, one thing was left. And that thing was hope. Exactly. So for the ancient Greeks, hope was a very powerful psychological, spiritual, and emotional phenomenon. Hope was that asset, that thing that remained with humanity and allows us all to cope and live and even thrive and be happy in a world that often is filled with trauma and tragedy and cruelty and evil. So very powerful psychological phenomenon. Unfortunately, I think that we have lost that view of hope largely in the Western world over the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. I can mainly speak to my own cultural context, which is, of course, growing up and living in the United States, but I've certainly seen it in lots of other Western nations as well, that I think people have lost this idea that hope is powerful, and instead I think there are two misconceptions, two misunderstandings of what hope is that have really gained a lot of, have really grown a lot and gained a lot of traction in the Western world. And I want to tell you both of those misunderstandings before I talk about how I understand hope. The first misunderstanding of hope is what I call a powerless view of hope. And this is the idea that hope is a warm, comforting feeling that we cling to when we don't know what else to do. That hope is comforting, it feels nice, but it's not very powerful. It's something that a nice comforting feeling that we have when we really have failed. This is everywhere, particularly in American culture. And just as one example, I want to show you this comic. This is a very famous comic strip that runs in a lot of American newspapers and has run for decades. This is Hagar the Horrible. I don't know if anyone's ever seen Hagar the Horrible. Here we have, these two Vikings hanging in a dungeon. Undoubtedly, they are going to be put to death. And one of them says to the other, "We are completely helpless, with no chance of escape. What in the world keeps us going?" And the other one says, "Hope." Well, this is wonderful. This is an interesting idea. But the idea here is that hope is a comforting feeling. Hope is not powerful in this comic strip, right? It's not going to break their chains. It's not going to set them free. It's not going to save their life. It's just going to comfort them while they die. It's just going to comfort them in the midst of tragedy. Now, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with comfort. Comfort is wonderful, and I certainly think that hope is comforting. But I think that hope is more than that. I think that hope can be a powerful force for change and for growth and for movement in our lives. Now, there's a second misconception of hope that I want to spend a little time on as well. And I think this one is even worse than the first one. And I think this second misconception has gained a lot of traction in Western culture around the world, maybe in the last 2 to 3 decades. And this is the idea that hope is an attitude involving distorting reality to paint a happy face over problems and obstacles in life. That hope is about distorting reality. It's about denying negative things and only thinking positive thoughts. So I am a clinician in addition to a professor, and I've done a lot of work with people who have been diagnosed with cancer. And this is, of course, one of the hardest things that any of us can imagine ever having in our lives. And I've had many patients and families come to me and say that the only way I can get better from my cancer is to only allow myself to think positive thoughts. I have to only be optimistic. I can never allow myself to think a negative thought. I can never have a negative feeling, because if I do, that will cause my cancer to grow and to eventually take my life. And so people try hard to force themselves to only think positively. They push down or ignore the negative. They repress the negative. Well, the research actually is very clear that this is not a helpful way to cope, right? It's not a helpful way to cope, because you're denying half of the experience of being human. In fact, psychologists have a word for this, and it's not hope, it's denial. It's denial, and denial is famously not a very healthy thing to do. So I certainly don't think that hope is denial. I think that hope accepts reality and builds on it. And I certainly don't think that hope is powerless and merely a comforting feeling. So what do I think hope is, and how do scientists, psychological scientists, think about hope? So I'm going to offer you a definition of hope that has been used in really hundreds of studies over the past 3 decades. And it's going to be, I think, the definition, the model, the theory of hope that is going to be used today. I want to give you a caveat before I begin talking about this definition by saying that this is my least favorite part of this talk. I talk about hope to audiences around the world and have given many, many talks over the past decade and a half. And this is always the part that I enjoy the least, because it's impossible to comprehensively define what hope is. There are probably as many right definitions of hope as there are people in this room, and in fact, as there are people in the world. Hope is a multifaceted, complex phenomenon. It has emotional aspects. It has aspects having to do with belief and the way we think about ourselves and our lives. It has spiritual and religious aspects. It is so complex that there is no way that I can give you a definition of hope that will really honor everything that hope is. So I'm not going to try. I'm not going to try to give you a definition that really summarizes hope. I'm going to give you just one model of hope, one idea about what hope is that's been useful for me over the decades. It's been useful in my work with my patients and my clients. It's been useful in my work as an educator and a university professor in thinking about how to teach and educate my students and expand and grow their lives. And it's been certainly useful in hundreds of research studies and has been shown to be quite a powerful way of thinking about hope. So it's not the only way of thinking about hope. It's not a complete way of thinking about hope, but I think it's a helpful one. And this definition of hope was first developed about 3 decades ago by Professor C.R. Snyder. His friends actually call him Rick Snyder, and he was a very good friend and a mentor of mine. He died about 15 years ago, and he spent his whole life trying to understand what hope is and how to use hope to improve people's lives. I like to tell stories about Rick, because Rick was this sort of stereotypical kind of crazy professor. His hair was never ever combed. This is the best he's ever looked. His hair was always sticking up like this. He actually was colorblind. He couldn't see the difference between red and green. And most people with color blindness try very hard to make sure their clothes match. He did not. So we would joke that he would come to school and he looked like he was dressed as a clown. Because he was so colorful. But this wasn't what he was about. He wasn't shallow in that way. Rick did some strange things. And one of the things that he liked to do was he liked to just walk around the campus of the University of Kansas, where he worked for his entire career. And he would look for students, unsuspecting students who he did not know. And he would run up to them and grab them. And they were, of course, surprised. And he would then ask them, "Tell me how you think." And he would take out a piece of paper and he would write down what they said. He was very curious about how people thought. And although this is a slightly strange thing to do, this is actually how he developed his theory of hope. This is how he developed this definition. He took a sabbatical for a year, and during this year, he did a very ambitious project. He approached community leaders. These were religious leaders of churches, of synagogues, of mosques, and other organizations. He approached politicians and political leaders. He went to business leaders. And he asked all of these leaders to give him all of the names of every single person in their lives that they thought was very hopeful, using whatever definition of hope they wanted. And he collected all of these names of all of these hopeful people. And during that year, he interviewed every single person on that list, as many of them who would speak to him. And he asked them that question: tell me how you think. How do you think? And he took notes. And at the end of that year, he made an important discovery. He realized that all of these very hopeful and successful people, by the way, all of them shared three things in common. He called these three things the three components of hope. But I actually think a better way of thinking about them is as the three conditions for hope to thrive. Because it turns out that all of these people had these three conditions set in their lives. And these are goals, pathways, and agency. And rather than give you dry technical definitions of what these are, I think a better way of doing it would be to just draw you a picture. Now, I have to admit before I start, I am very bad at drawing pictures. So please forgive me. This is you. Doesn't that look like you? This is you. Pretend this is you. And you're not happy in this cartoon. You're not hopeful. You're not feeling hopeful. And you're not feeling hopeful because you're wandering around in the world aimlessly. Notice this slide is all empty. There's nothing for you to do. There's nowhere for you to go. And you're not going to be happy and hopeful until you get the first condition for hope to thrive, and that is a goal. So, according to Rick Snyder's definition of hope, the first thing you need for hope to thrive is to have something to hope for. Now, of course, none of this is something you already don't know. You already know that. You're naturally hopeful people, most likely. You probably have many goals in your life. Many, many goals. I don't love the word goal. The word goal, in English at least, is a very formal word. For me, when I hear the English word goal, it brings up ideas of very formal things that I want in my life. Things like to get a promotion at work, or to make more money, or to get better grades. But actually, Rick Snyder meant this word to be much more expansive, much more general. Within this theory, a goal is anything that you want in your life. Anything that you want to get, or be, or do, or accomplish, or feel. Goals can be very small or very large, and they can be in any area of your life. So you certainly can have formal goals, like getting a promotion or making more money, but you can also have goals in your spiritual or your religious life, right? To be closer to God, or whatever you believe in, to pray more often, to go to synagogue more regularly, whatever it happens to be. You can have relationship goals, to love more fully, to be a better husband or wife or partner, to be a better parent, to deepen in your relationship with your friends. So you can have goals in any area of your life. And of course, most of us have many, many of these. But you need at least one in order for hope to thrive. So this is the first condition that you have to have set in your life. But you're still not happy. You're still not hopeful, because I want you to notice this big gap between you and your goal. And you're not going to be hopeful until you get the second condition for hope to thrive. Again, not a very complicated thing, probably something you all already know, because chances are you would be on this list of hopeful people. And this is my way of drawing a plan, a strategy, some way of getting you from where you are to where you want to be. It turns out that all of these hopeful people have not only usually one plan, but multiple plans. People who are naturally high in hope once they determine to have a goal, oftentimes they develop many, many different plans to get to that goal, just in case one of them is blocked for some reason. By the way, it turns out that people who are lower in hope don't do this. And there are a lot of those people in the world. But you're still not happy, you're still not hopeful, because even though you have a goal, you have your plan, you're still missing the third condition for hope to thrive. And maybe you've been in this little guy's position before. You can ask yourself this question: have you ever had a goal that was important to you, something that you very much wanted to accomplish? You had a plan that you were pretty sure would work to get you there, but for whatever reason, you just felt lazy. You just couldn't get up and find the energy or the motivation to do it. Have you ever felt that way? Do you want to admit that you felt that way? Chances are you didn't feel very hopeful at that moment, and that's because you're lacking the third condition for hope to thrive, which this is simply my way of drawing the energy or the motivation to get up and put your plan into action and pursue your goal. So again, none of this is complicated, but it turns out that now you're happy, all of the people that Rick interviewed had these three conditions set in their lives, and he called these goals. These are his technical terms for them. Goals, pathways, that's the planning part, and agency is Rick's way of talking about the energy or the motivation. It's a very simple theory, but it turns out that people who have these conditions set in their lives have all kinds of positive outcomes, are generally much more successful in education, they're in a better state of health, they're much happier, and I'll give you some of that research as we move forward. Now, I do want to say, before I move on from the definition, that this diagram is overly simple, right? Life is not this easy. It's not as if you have not your nice goals, your pathway, your agency, and then you instantly get there. That's not the way life works. Real life looks a little more like this. You have your goal, you have your pathway or your plan, you have your agency, and then life blocks your path. Something happens that stands in the way of achieving your goal. The natural human tendency when something blocks your path, or at least something that a lot of people do, is that they search for who to blame for this. I don't know if you've ever met anyone that did that. I had a student about 3 weeks ago. I teach graduate students. And very smart student. She's a very smart student, but she really just didn't work very hard in my class. And she wrote a paper. It wasn't very good. She took a test. It wasn't very good. Oops. And so I gave her a bad grade. And she came to my office, and she was very angry. And she blamed me for it. She externalized the blame, right? She had a block to her goal of getting a good grade, and she came in and she said, "Professor Feldman, you're a bad teacher, you're a bad person, you're unfair." None of that's true because everyone else got good grades. But she externalized the blame. Other people, of course, internalize the blame, right? They might say, "There's something wrong with me. I'm stupid, I'm no good, I'm worthless." This is something that a lot of people do. Well, it turns out that people who are high in hope don't do any of that. They don't externalize or internalize the blame. Instead, they ask themselves an incredibly hopeful question. They ask themselves, what am I going to do now? So hopeful people don't play this blame game. Instead, they simply immediately try to find an alternative pathway around the blockage to their goal. And since life is complicated and difficult, we have to do this all the time, don't we? And so this is one explanation for why, as I'll talk about, hopeful people are not only happier in life, but also tend to be more successful in life. So that's the definition of hope. If I were in your place, I would be wondering at this point, I would be asking myself, how hopeful am I? Chances are you know simply from the way I've talked about hope, whether you have these three conditions set in your life. But in case you don't, I actually want to give you a little test of your hope. Because it turns out there are some very good ways of measuring hope. that psychological researchers have used over the past 3 decades. The most common one is called the Hope Scale. And it's a very quick, just a few questions, and it'll give you your level, your score of hope. And I actually want to give you the questions. I'm going to give you a 6-question version of this. And I would invite you to take this yourself. I know you all have notepads, so maybe you can write down your answers, and then I'll tell you how to score it if you'd like. Or if you're good at math, you can just add up the numbers as you go. I'm not that good at math. So I am going to give you 6 questions. They're going to be in Hebrew. So that's going to be good, hopefully. I'm going to give you 6 questions, and I'd like you to answer them all on this scale. So I hope that I did this right. This is supposed to say totally not true, and this is supposed to say totally true. Okay. This is actually a version of the scale that was translated, I think, by Professor Malcolm Margulies. So thank her for this. So here are the 6 questions, and I'd just like you to write your answers, and then you're just going to add them up at the end. Question number 1. And in English, this says, if I should find myself in a jam, I can think of many ways to get out of it. So just give your rating on a scale from 1 to 8. The next one. At the present time, I am energetically pursuing my goals. It's getting a little hot in here, isn't it? The third one. There are lots of ways around any problem I am facing now. Just write down your answers or add up the total. The fourth one, right now I see myself as being pretty successful. Is the Hebrew right? Okay, good. Because when I copied and pasted it, it reversed it. It did it backwards, and I'm looking at it saying, that doesn't look right. Number 5, I can think of many ways to reach my goals. And the last one, number 6, at this time I am meeting the goals that I have set for myself. So this gives you a snapshot of your hope in 6 questions, 6 very quick questions. And this test of hope has been used in really dozens, actually hundreds of studies at this point. Very simple way of measuring hope. To get your total hope score, simply add up the numbers. So simply add them all up, and that will give you a score. And here is the hope thermometer. Here's how you interpret this score. The lowest score, of course, you can get is a 6. The highest score you can get is a 48. And the normal score, the average or mean score, is a 34. So here's how you interpret this. Across multiple samples, lots of studies, the average score is a 34. That can be give or take a few points. So if you got anywhere from, say, a 30 to maybe a 40 or so, that's kind of normal or average levels of hope. So if you got around a 34, give or take a few points, congratulations, you are normal. You are normal. You have normal hope. What that means is you're probably pretty successful in life. You're probably relatively happy. You're probably pretty good at accomplishing your goals. If you're in school, you probably work relatively hard and get reasonably good grades. If you are higher than average, the closer you are to 48, the more you have those 3 conditions for Hope to Thrive set in your life. Congratulations. If you're lower than 34, the closer you are to 6, of course, the less you have those conditions set in your life. So if you're very low, don't worry. It's okay. The good news is research shows that you can increase your hope. With intention and with practice, you can increase your hope. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So everybody know what their hope score is or have an idea? Okay. So let's talk about the benefits of hope. Why does any of this matter? Now that you know where your hope level is, why does any of this matter? And this is where I talk about 30 years of research in 10 minutes. I'll try my best. There are hundreds of studies. I obviously can't talk about all of them, but I will give you a sample of some of them, And I'll spare you most of the technical details of the research methodology, but I'll mainly give you the conclusions. Occasionally, I'll talk about some of the details. And I'm going to talk about it first in education, then I'll talk about it in psychotherapy, and third, I'll talk about it in physical health care. So let's start with education. So there are now lots of studies that show that hope predicts grades. They've done those studies in elementary school students, in high school students, in university students, and even in graduate students and law students. And we know that there is a very strong, a very strong association between hope and grades. In fact, hope predicts grades better than other things that we know are important, like study skills. Hope is as important as having good study skills. And yet, we very rarely pay attention to students' levels of hope. Hope is also related to graduation rates in college. So we know in the university, a certain percentage of students do not graduate, they drop out. And we know that higher hope students are much more likely to graduate than lower hope students. Hope is also related to athletic performance. So there have been a number of studies that will test athletes' performance, and then we'll see if test athletes' hope, and see if they can use that to predict later performance. There was a very famous study done at the University of Kansas, which is a very good athletic school in the United States, and they tested athletes' performance using that same 6-question hope scale you just took, and then they followed them in their track and field athletics for the whole season. And they found that hope, those simple 6 questions, predicted how they would do that season, predicted their performance better than their physical conditioning, better than the physical condition of their body. And last, hope predicts goal accomplishment in general. We did a study, some colleagues of mine and I, that was published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, where we brought college students, university students, into a lab at the beginning of the semester, and we asked them to name their goals. Anything in their life they wanted to accomplish. They named all kinds of things. They named academic goals. They named personal goals in their personal life, to meet somebody to love, to meet a boyfriend or a girlfriend, to increase the number of friends they have. One woman said that she wanted to win a marathon. So there's lots of goals that they named. We then brought them back into the lab 4 months later at the end of the semester. We gave them their list of goals back, and we asked them to indicate how much progress, how much success they've had on each of their goals. And it turns out that people with higher hope were much more likely to indicate that they had accomplished their goals. I want to zoom in a little bit more on this connection between hope and grades, because I think it's a really important one, and I want to give you a sense of how powerful it is. So this is a study that I did with one of my students, Max Kubota. We published it just a few years ago. And it was a very simple study. We got a very large sample of undergraduate university students. We gave them a hope test, very similar to the hope scale you took a few minutes ago. And then we accessed their grades, their overall grades at the university. And here's what we found. So you see along this axis, it says grade point average. I'm sure you're all familiar with what GPA is, but in the US, this is a summary of all of their grades in all of their courses, right? With 0 meaning that they failed at everything, and 4 meaning that they've done 100% perfectly on everything. Generally speaking, good grades are considered between 3 and 4. So that's our target. So the low hope students, not very good grades, 2.85. In terms of letter grades, this is a B range grade. It's not terrible, but it's probably not going to help you too much in your life. Medium hope students had pretty good grades, 3.33. And high hope students had 3.57. So this is the 90th percentile. So that's quite good. So it turns out that hope is very powerful in predicting people's grades. Let's talk about psychotherapy or mental health care. Ooh, it's getting a little cooler in here. That's good. First of all, hope is highly related to depression. People who have these 3 conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives tend to be less depressed, less prone to clinical depression, etc. They're more resilient. So lots of bad things happen in our lives. We all encounter traumas and tragedies. We lose people that we love. We encounter failures and obstacles and problems in our lives. And it turns out that people who are high in hope cope with this better. They seem to bounce back faster, and they even are more likely to grow as a result of these traumas and tragedies. Hope is highly related to meaning and purpose. People who have higher hope feel that their lives are more meaningful. And hope is also predicts outcomes in psychotherapy. So there was a study done by a researcher named Lori Irving a few years ago, where she accessed a large sample of patients who were about to enter psychotherapy. These were people who had all kinds of problems: depression, anxiety disorders, lots of other problems in their life. And before they started psychotherapy, she gave them the hope scale. She asked them essentially, how hopeful are you that therapy will work? And then she followed them during all of the months they were in therapy. And it turns out that how hopeful they were before starting therapy predicted how successful therapy would be, predicted the outcome of therapy. Now, you might say, well, that's just the placebo effect. They expected it to work, and so it did. And I think, yes, it is the placebo effect. In fact, I think that when we talk about the placebo effect, what we're talking about is hope. Right? All of these drug trials, all of these medication studies where they take people with a disease and they give half the people an active medication, they give the other half of people a sugar pill, right, that's not active. Always in these studies, a certain percentage, it's usually around 30%, of people who take the sugar pill get better. Well, why is that? It's because they're hopeful that the pill will work. And so I actually think that we should be studying the placebo effect more carefully, because I think that it's really about hope. And that leads us into the last topic, which is physical health care. People who have these conditions for hope to thrive in their life take better care of themselves. I think that's rather obvious. They tend to eat a better diet, lower in fat, lower in salt. They eat more healthy foods. I probably could do that a little more myself. They exercise more. They go to the doctor more regularly for regular checkups. As a result of that, we have brand new data, it's not published yet, that people with high hope have lower body mass, they have lower cholesterol, and they have more appropriate blood sugar, they have lower blood pressure. All of these are risk factors for heart attacks, right, for cardiovascular disease. And so this has real impacts on health. People with higher hope live longer. So there was a study that was done a number of years ago that it was done actually in the 90s. And the researchers were interested in the opposite of hope. They were interested in hopelessness. People who feel completely hopeless, without hope. They got a sample, a very large sample, of more than 2,000 men with heart disease. And they followed them for many, many years. And what they found is the more hopeless that the men felt about their life, but also about their disease, the more likely they were to die of a heart attack during the study. So hope predicts mortality. There's lots of hope. There's lots of research on hope and cancer as well. Now, I need to be careful how I talk about this research, because there are not any studies yet that show that hope cures cancer. I wish there were, but there aren't. Hope doesn't seem to be quite that powerful. However, there are lots of studies that show that hope helps people to cope with cancer better. Being diagnosed with cancer is one of the hardest things I can imagine. It tends to cause people a lot of fear and anxiety, of course, a lot of depression. There's pain, physical pain involved often, and other symptoms. And what we know from dozens of studies is that people who have been diagnosed with cancer who have higher hope cope a lot better. They tend to be happier. They tend to have higher levels of psychological and emotional well-being as they fight their cancer. And that's a very positive outcome. And then last, hope is related to pain. I don't know if any of you work in a hospital, but around the hospital that I work in, we have lots of these little signs hung on the wall. Have you ever seen this? A pain rating scale where you rate your pain from 0 to 10. And we are supposed to be in the habit of constantly asking our patients who have physical illnesses, what is your pain level? Well, it turns out that lots of chronic health conditions have pain involved. Think about things like spinal cord problems, think about things like arthritis, even cancer, right, can have pain involved, bone pain, and et cetera. And what we know from about 3 or 4 studies at this point is that people with high hope have less pain, even with the same chronic illnesses. There's something about hope that makes people feel the pain as less painful. And if you think about it, this makes sense, because if you have low hope, you're going to tend to worry more, and you're going to tend to focus on your physical symptoms, and that's going to make you feel the pain more. Whereas if you have higher hope, you're going to tend to focus on other goals and other things more. It's going to take your mind off the pain and the symptoms, and you're going to tend to feel the pain less. So lots of outcomes, and this is just a small sample of the outcomes in healthcare. So there's lots more. So here's my most profound and important slide of the entire presentation. Hope is good. As if you needed me to tell you that, right? But at least now you know some of the research about hope. So that leads me to the last topic. Can hope be increased? So all of this research that I presented so far is correlating people with naturally high hope with outcomes. So we know that people who naturally have these conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives have positive outcomes in education, psychotherapy, and physical health. But what if you're not naturally high in hope? What if you took that hope test I gave you a few minutes ago and your score was kind of low? Can we increase your level of hope? And the answer is, happily, yes, we can. And I want to tell you about a study. Actually, there have been many studies done, some of which I've done with people who are in attendance tonight, including Professor Margalit. But I want to tell you about a fairly comprehensive study that we did back in 2006, which is one of the more complex studies so far. This was of an 8-session group therapy to increase hope, where we taught hopeful thinking skills. So the way that we did this is we got a fairly large sample of people. These were all adults suffering from a variety of mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. We divided them into 2 groups. Half of the participants in the treatment condition received our intervention. So they participated in these 8 sessions of group hope therapy. The other half did not. They got no intervention, no treatment. That's the control condition. The research had 3 phases. At the first phase, we gave all of them a pre-test. So before the study started, we assessed their level of depression, we assessed their level of anxiety, we assessed their level of meaning in life and purpose in life, and we assessed their hope. Then, phase 2, people in the treatment condition got 8 hope group therapy sessions. These sessions lasted for 2 hours each, met for 8 weeks, and we taught them how to set the conditions for hope to thrive in their life. So we taught them how do you set workable, doable goals. We taught them how to make plans and how to have multiple pathways if a pathway is blocked. We taught them how to find ways of motivating themselves and how to increase their agency. So all of the things we've talked about so far. The control condition, as I said, got no treatment. And then at phase 3, we did post-testing. So after the study was completely over, we assessed people's depression, anxiety, meaning in life, and hope again. And here are the results. So along this axis, you see hope. So for the people who went through the hope therapy, before the study began, this was their level of hope. And if you remember that hope thermometer from before, this is pretty low, right? 24 is pretty low hope. 8 weeks later, after the therapy, this was their hope. So they increased by 9.22 points. That's a pretty big increase. The people in the no treatment group didn't increase very much. I mean, time is often helpful, right? But it was only a 3.71 point increase. So hope therapy is much more helpful than time. What about for meaning and purpose? Even a more dramatic result, the hope therapy group increasing in their meaning and purpose by more than 11 points, and the no treatment group increasing hardly at all. For depression, you can see it lowered their depression quite substantially from before to after, and the people who received no treatment barely moved in terms of their depression. And for anxiety, again, a fairly big result, big decrease in hope, and for this, pretty much the same. It's interesting that before the treatment, the people in our no treatment group actually were a little higher, the people in the hope therapy group were actually a little higher, but afterwards they ended up even lower than the people who went through no treatment. And for those of you who are who like statistics, these are all statistically significant, and they are medium to large effect sizes. So this is pretty powerful stuff. This isn't the only study. Here are a bunch more. Some of them you'll recognize names in this room. We continue to do a lot of research on this. Most of this research is actually not on the 8-session therapy. We have developed a 1-session therapy, a 90-minute workshop that we have done with university students around the world. We've done it here in Israel. The first study was at my home university, at Santa Clara University. It's been done in Spain. It's been done at the University of Alabama with nursing students. It's been done at Florida State. It's been done really all over. And what we find is in one session with university students, we can increase their hope, we can increase their chances of accomplishing their goals, and we can even increase their GPA. We can increase their grades in the longer term. So pretty powerful stuff. And if you're curious about the techniques and things in this studies, I'm always happy to answer questions and talk with you afterwards. So in the last maybe 3 or 4 minutes that I have before I get off the stage, I thought that I would take some time with the question, what can I do? Because maybe after listening to this, we've talked about what hope is, why it's important in terms of outcomes. I've told you that it's changeable. You might be wondering if your hope score is a little bit low, or if you know someone whose hope is a little bit low, or if the patients or the students you work with have low hope, how can you increase it? Well, there's no way I can give you all the techniques that we use in therapy in 3 or 4 minutes, but I thought I would share with you 4 simple tips, 4 things that you can do in your lives and you can share with others that you can do very quickly. These are things you can do in 1 minute or less. And that we know through the research, if you do them regularly, you will slowly increase your hope over time. So the first one is don't be afraid to hope. I was talking to a reporter here in Israel who's writing a story for a newspaper a few days ago. He's writing about this conference. And he said to me, that when he was little, he was given the advice, don't get your hopes up, right? Don't hope too much, because if you have too much hope, it will backfire and it will mean you're less likely to accomplish your goals. In English, we have the saying, don't jinx it. You're jinxing it by having too high a hope. And then if you do fail, you're going to feel even worse. Does that sound familiar to people? Well, I want to tell you that is not true. There have been 7 studies now that have tried to find that, and all of them have failed. In fact, there does not seem to be anything dangerous or problematic about having goals, pathways, and agency. It doesn't lead to more disappointment. It doesn't sabotage your chances of accomplishing your goals. In fact, in every single study that's ever been done, having high hope means you're more likely to succeed. So don't be afraid to hope. Second, set personally meaningful goals. When I was defining hope, I told you that the first condition for hope to thrive is having something to hope for, right? Having a goal. And I told you that probably all of us in this room have many, many goals in our lives. The problem is that in our busy lives, we might have many goals, But oftentimes those goals are things we have to do. They're not things that we want to do, right? You probably have goals. You have to go to work because you have to make money to pay your rent. You have goals maybe for your children because you want to raise them the right way. You have goals if you're a student. You have to study because you want to get a good job and you want to be successful. You might have goals that you have to do for your boss, right? Or for your husband or for your wife. The problem is that oftentimes we forget to have goals that are personally meaningful for us. And so my encouragement to you would be to ask yourself before you leave this auditorium today, if you're in that position where you don't have many goals in your life that are personally meaningful to you, are all the goals that you're pursuing things you have to do, not things that you truly want to do? And if they're all things that you have to do, see if you can set one goal for this week, even if it's a small one. One goal to do something that actually would give you some personal sense of meaning. Because we know that's highly related to hope. It's hard to have agency and pathways when all your goals are things that you don't really care about, right? Third, be aware of where your hope falters. We talked about that hope is about goals, but we also talked about these two other conditions for hope to thrive, right? Agency and pathways. And so people can have low hope because they're low in only one of these, right? Somebody might be high in agency but low in pathways, or high in pathways but low in agency. So I've noticed that in my life, when I feel not very hopeful, I like to check in with myself and ask myself, right now, am I low in pathways or am I low in agency? Because I think that how you solve that problem, how you raise your hope, is different depending on whether you're low in pathways or low in agency. If you're low in agency, it means that you're having trouble with motivation, with energy, that you feel low energy. So there are lots of simple things you can do, right? You can simply eat better, improve your diet. You can exercise more. There's lots of evidence that regular exercise, even small 5 minutes, 10 minutes daily of exercise, it might not help your health, but it does help give you more motivation and energy, more agency. We know that better sleep gives you more agency. Sometimes when I'm feeling low agency, I will call a friend. Do you have these friends in your life that are like really high energy, like really enthusiastic? And I call them and they will encourage me and inspire me. Right? You know those people. They can be annoying sometimes, but then other times they can be encouraging. If there is a particular piece of music that you find inspiring or energizing, listen to that during your commute to work, right? There's some research that shows that listening regularly to inspiring music can raise your motivation. Very simple things, but very important for agency. For pathways, if you're low on pathways, that means you're having trouble planning. It means you have a goal, but you're having trouble thinking about what are the steps that you need to get there, or perhaps you know the steps, but they're blocked. So you need help with planning. So what I do when I need help with pathways is I call mentors. I call people who I trust, who I think are very good at planning and plotting out steps to get to goals. For me, often, I'm fortunate, that's my father. He's very good at that, but it might be mentors at work, colleagues, friends. And so these interventions for agency and pathways are quite different. And so I think it's just helpful to check in with yourself and ask, well, which is it? Because that might give you clues as to how to improve your hope. And then the last little piece of advice I want to give you is to allow yourself to daydream. I wish I had more time to talk about this. When I was a child, I was told by adults that it's bad to daydream. Were you told that? That it's bad to daydream, that you should concentrate on what you're doing, that you should not let your mind wander. But it turns out that there's quite a lot of research that shows that daydreaming is actually good for you. In fact, one of the techniques that we use in our hope therapy research is we ask people to do a visualization exercise. We ask people to daydream. Now, I'm not talking about daydreaming. I'm not talking about crazy daydreams like you can fly in a bathtub, with a penguin. And I'm not talking about, that you have magical powers. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about realistic daydreams about your goals, about what you want in life. Try closing your eyes and envisioning what it'll feel like when you accomplish that difficult goal that right now feels really hard, but that you really want. Close your eyes and get excited about that. We know that daydreaming, when you daydream about your real life goals, can get you excited and increase your motivation, increase your agency. Sometimes it can also help you plan, because during your daydream you may have an insight about a better pathway that you can use. So don't be afraid to hope, but also don't be afraid to daydream and get excited about the future. These are just some of the techniques that we use in our hope therapy. We use a lot more complicated ones, but these are some things that I think if you do them in very small amounts during your life, that slowly but surely they will help you to increase your hope and improve the way that you live. And I truly hope that something that I've been able to tell you during this presentation has helped you to improve the way you live too. Thank you very much for your attention.